It's very hot in Crimea again. The Ukrainian Armed Forces delivered a powerful strike on enemy targets in the temporarily occupied peninsula, destroying 3 Pantsir S-1 air defense systems and a BK-16 high-speed landing craft. Additionally, the next round of trilateral negotiations between Ukraine, the US, and Russia is tentatively scheduled to take place on March 11th in Istanbul. This is being reported by the Western press. But, attention, the president's office has not confirmed this information. And by the way, about Turkey. The country's President Erdogan openly spoke out against Iran after Tehran launched ballistic missiles at Turkey. Greetings, friends. This is the project In the Crosshairs. My name is Volodymyr Timoshenko. Let's get started. Friends, right now Yuriy Rashkin, host of the Raskin Report channel, is joining our broadcast. Yuriy, hello. Thank you so much for finding the time. I'm very glad to see you. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
And Yuriy, I have my first question for you. We're working with you live on air. Naturally, on days like these, the news just pours in like a cornucopia. And here's what the Western press is writing. Iran's strategy in the war against the US and Israel is now clear, or so they claim, to inflict such hellish economic losses on Trump that as a result, the US president will be forced to abandon the war. What do you think? Does this theory have a right to exist, or is it, in your opinion, too simplistic a scheme?
Well, we know that when it comes to President Trump, he prefers simple schemes. So here, everything is quite straightforward and noticeable. And when we look at what the president reacts to most painfully and sensitively, it's the markets, it's the costs, both his own and those that could turn out to be beneficial for voters. Gas prices are very important to voters because in the United States, a car is not a luxury, it's a means of transportation, especially in rural areas. So if gas prices jump, and mine have gone up by literally 80 cents just in the past week, I live in the state of Wisconsin. I've already heard from another viewer who writes from Colorado that their prices have jumped by $1.20 over the past week. That's a very big increase because, of course, a car holds more than 1 gallon. And on the other hand, when we talk about diesel fuel, which is used by trucks and lorries, that's even more expensive, which means a spike for businesses, a spike in costs. Accordingly, all this drives up prices, puts pressure and strain on the president, and demands that he urgently do something. Because even though Iran is now declaring that they are ready for a long war, the president actually doesn't have that kind of time, even if he says he does. He says he'll go on as long as he wants, that he won't get bored. But we understand that in reality, time is a major factor for him. And now we are actually testing how similar Trump is to Putin, because Putin thought he would take Kiev in 3 days. It didn't work out. And now, for the 5th year, he has been waging his big war with no chance of success, not to compare the political regimes of different countries in any way. Trump clearly had the goal of reaching a quick agreement. That's not happening.
And by the way, yes, you put it very clearly, a very direct parallel between Putin and, in this context, Trump. From your perspective, looking back, yes, it's very difficult to get inside Donald Trump's head, but still, what do you think? Do the benefits from starting this war, as cynical as it may sound, now outweigh the losses? Because, well, we still don't know when this war will end.
Well, Trump's hope and calculation is that it will all end with his victory. Prices will spike, support will surge, prices will drop. Pardon me, support will surge. In general, everything will move in the right direction as soon as he has victory in his hands. And only he can decide when to declare victory, and he will decide what counts as victory. And it doesn't matter what Iran thinks about it. The United States has won. Hooray. And we leave. And here, this could go on for quite a long time, or it could end quickly, depending on how costly the operation turns out to be. You see, again, comparing, though I'd rather not, but comparing the two wars for Putin, the price and cost of this war aren't as important because he doesn't care about public sentiment. What difference does it make? But in the United States, that's an important factor. And now we're testing how much Putin is like Trump, how much Putin can get bogged down in a war, and how much Trump can say, no, this is a lost cause. You see, after all, he declared bankruptcy 6 times, Donald Trump did. And that means that at some point you say, that's it, there's nothing more to be done here, I'm leaving. And in a way, he's not against it. He's used to it. He drives the situation into a dead end, then says, bankruptcy, I'm out. And he says, I'm actually the smartest one because I got out of there in time. So, to put it this way, if we compare these two people, I really hope that history will show us that at some point Trump will say, this is a lost cause and walk away. But just like Putin, he is surrounded by people who tell him what he wants to hear. So, are we winning? We are winning. Are we close to victory? We are close to victory. But let's see how Trump will react to the fact that his popularity is falling. Historically, wars always start with strong support for the president.
Yes.
But since this president decided not to explain anything to anyone, he started out with low support. It was basically only his own supporters who backed him. And now that support is evaporating, since in fact even his own people didn't want the war. So Trump has found himself in a very weak and unpredictable situation here. And despite all the support he might get, it will quickly disappear, because at first people will be glad that the war is over, but then what? And then we'll see that supply chains have been disrupted and prices have shot up. Trump would like prices to collapse, but that's not necessarily what will happen, especially considering that now there's even greater damage to the infrastructure. It's unclear what's happening with the Dardanelles Strait and so on and so forth. It feels like the White House didn't calculate the consequences of their actions.
So now regarding, to wrap up the topic of Americans' discontent, right? There's this story about how US citizens created a petition to mobilize and send Trump's son, Barron Trump, to war. This is kind of a continuation of that story that Americans won't stay silent. This is not Putin's electorate.
This is not Putin's electorate. Then at the moment in the United States, you can create any petition and people can sign it and see what happens. It seems Trump said that Barron couldn't serve because he's too tall. They came up with something for him over there. In general, somehow he just didn't fit in somewhere. But the main thing is that Trump himself dodged military service. This is an important point, because when there are leaders who have no military experience, it usually means they are more inclined to wage war. And when we see a change of generations, when politicians who remember or in some way understand World War II are leaving us, we end up in a world of unscared idiots. And Trump is, in a way, the pinnacle of the baby boomer generation, those who were born after World War II. Everything was wonderful for them. And now all that's left is to solve a few problems, deal with Iran, deal with Cuba, and then you can die in peace.
Yes, indeed. I think that this move by Trump, who knows? Of course, we'll see. But was it really worth it? To put it mildly, that's a very debatable question. Well, first of all, let me clarify. We all understand that war is by no means a game. In this case, it was just a figure of speech. By the way, today, Yuri, President Erdogan once again responded to the fact that an Iranian missile was flying, while the one that was shot down was flying toward Turkey, and as far as I understood, was shot down in the country's airspace. The fact is, more and more countries are getting drawn into the war. It seems to me that Trump didn't expect this either. Wouldn't you agree?
Not only did Trump absolutely not expect this, but it's actually an incredible advantage for Ukraine, because it suddenly turned out that instead of being a weak country dependent on the mercy of its allies, instead of relying on the United States, Ukraine turned out to be that specialist, like when you need a plumber and no one but a plumber can solve your problem. And suddenly, the Ukrainian plumber appears who can solve this problem. And everyone rushes because everyone has problems. All the countries in the region are running to Ukraine for help. And Trump is turning to Ukraine for help. This is an incredibly valuable moment that should be noted and I think taken advantage of, because I believe that exchanging a certain number of drones for a certain number of Tomahawks or Patriots would be quite appropriate here. And the main thing is not to exchange them for those that will come in the future, because if we use up what we have now, the future ones will only arrive in 10 years. It has to be for the ones that are available now, because with these kinds of drones, well, you don't need Patriots, but Ukraine could really use them. That's why I think it's important to understand just how valuable this moment is for Ukraine, when it suddenly turns out that it is the very weapon everyone urgently needs right now. And the fact that Iran has now decided to strike at everyone is being interpreted in different ways. Some experts believe that this means Iran has decided to show everyone don't come too close, or on the contrary, they've decided to show just how wild and dangerous they are. But the fact remains that they are getting others involved. They've demonstrated the vulnerability of the countries in the region as a whole. Now we're hearing discussions about why we even need to build data centers, which now support artificial intelligence in the desert, in such a dangerous, risky place when there's such a valuable resource. Oh, why would we do that? Then how could we have even thought of such a thing? So the issue of regional security has collapsed incredibly quickly here. And now countries like Ukraine, which have experience and have faced adversity, suddenly become an incredibly valuable resource.
Yes, indeed. I want to add to your perfectly logical point that Ukraine has already sent specialists to the Middle East to help combat Iranian Shaheds. As they say, well, the experience gained over all these years is truly invaluable at this point. It's now the 5th year since the full-scale war began. Without a doubt, the armed forces of Ukraine have this kind of experience. And if we look at this situation from another angle, the topic you brought up, it's clear what it means for Ukraine. But what does this war mean for the Russian Federation? I just can't forget how Peskov recently said, so cynically and with a half smirk, that Russia will, in any case, look for its own benefit in the war in the Middle East. So, in your opinion, does the Kremlin currently have more advantages at this moment? And what about in the long term?
This is an important point, especially in the long-term perspective.
Yes.
But first, I would like to say that just a few days ago, Senator Whitehouse spoke on the Senate floor and linked all the accusations against Trump, tying him not only to Epstein, but also to the Kremlin, stating that if he were a Russian agent, we don't understand what he would be doing differently. He basically behaves in that way. If this duck quacks, looks, and moves like a duck, then, well, certain conclusions seem inevitable. So from this point of view, of course, Trump's actions, well, one should look for the presumption that this benefits Russia. And then you can argue whether it's yes or no in the long term or the short term, because in the short term, I think it is still helping Russia since it's more money flowing into Russia's budget due to the fact that despite all the sanctions and price caps, Russia will receive more money. But in the long term, it seems to me this is a blow, first of all, to Russia's authority, because being a client of Russia, being part of the axis of evil, does not mean that the other members of the axis will particularly support you. Yes, Iran is now preparing for the long term. Yes, Russia is planning to send some instructors, and yes, perhaps China will start doing something. But for now, we're talking about American-Israeli military power, which is basically crushing everything in its path. And the long-term benefit for the Kremlin means, well, in the long term, this means a loss for the Kremlin because Iran is being destroyed even as a supplier of drones. Well, I understand there's a debate about how much of the drones are already being made in Russia, but nevertheless, it seems to me that this is a source of assistance for Russia that will no longer exist. It's gone. That's it. Now, Iran is preoccupied with its own problems. So from the perspective of an ally, that's a minus. From the perspective of money, that's a plus. But it should be noted that when it comes to money, there's this point. Since energy prices are now skyrocketing at a very, very fast pace, there will be a shock, just like when we recently had tariffs on China at 150%, which was simply a shock. It stopped trade with China. Empty ships were returning because people were calling and saying, take my cargo off your ship. I can't pay for it when it arrives here. That's why if prices jump too high, and that's what OPEC relies on, it needs to stay within a certain range, not too high, not too low. And now prices have gone in an absolutely insane direction at an incredible speed. And this means there will simply be a collapse of economic activity, which will also hit various countries that are suppliers of energy resources.